I've always been a casual Sonic fan. I've played the games and sucked at most of them. I watched the shows, got the toys, so I'd say I'm rather familiar with the franchise. My relationship has been a pretty constant, mild interest for a fun franchise with lots of appeal that has a 50-50 chance of meeting those expectations. There is, however, one character who always piqued my interest, and with the new movie coming out, is doing the same for the whole world, for a second time. Shadow the Hedgehog is a name practically as ubiquitous as Sonic himself and is often touted as just as cool, if not cooler, because of his darker everything. In his debut, Shadow took the world by storm as this dark reflection of Sonic, even being the speed representative of the dark story. Okay, so the point is that he's a dark character. And throughout the story, we watch Shadow's evil plot unfold to destroy the Earth and take revenge on humanity. But revenge for what? While Shadow is cool as a villain in Sonic Adventure 2, it is when we discover the reason for his mission, that being the tragedy he suffered when the military killed his best and only friend Maria, we find there is a lot more depth to him than first appeared. At the end of the story, Shadow is reminded that Maria wanted to give humanity a chance, leaving him to set things right and sacrifice himself. And as if this tragedy wasn't mind-blowing enough for Sonic fans, the change of heart compels us even more. This arc that Shadow goes through from a complete villain to a dark hero was supposed to be his end, but when he was reintroduced in Sonic Heroes, he embodied more of a bad boy persona, to put it simply, which became a full-on anti-hero in his own spin-off game. And I mean this in a pretty general sense, because I simply want to discuss what draws us to these bad boy characters by examining who Shadow is and going through important parts of his story. So let's discuss the self-titled game that redefined Shadow the Hedgehog, for better or for worse, and get to understand why this matters. Before we do though, I'd like to mention part of the inspiration for this video. Nezumi VA's video, Why Shadow the Hedgehog Still Matters. A truly brilliant video that goes very in-depth to the many layers of this game and character. Like her, it seems many people, like myself, never really beat this game because as a tiny baby child, I didn't really grasp the different paths concept, so it didn't really impact me. But I was very obsessed with those cinematics. These, as well as the game in its entirety, were part of Sega's plan to sell Shadow as a violent renegade who does things his way. The whole story revolves around aliens coming to invade the world, a regular Tuesday for the Sonic franchise, and the leader of the army, Black Doom, who reveals he had a hand in creating Shadow, wants to use him to do it. The main idea is Shadow grappling over choosing whether or not to do what is considered right or wrong by the opposing factions, or doing his own thing. There is obviously a lot more than just that, but for that, again, I recommend Nezumi's video. The new edge they added to his character not only gave him this infamous nickname, Edgy the Hedgy, but also drove his image to an almost inescapable bad boy reputation in the public sphere. It took the nuanced moral conflict within this character, who came so close to destroying the world out of vengeance, and only stopping because of the only person he cared for, and amplified that ambivalence toward the world to allow for a more badass, rebellious anti-hero, similar to the likes of the Punisher, who exemplify those hard, masculine qualities associated with the bad boy aesthetic. Think guns, motorbikes, dark colors, etc. It took his aggressive nature and turned it into a violent anger that could and would be directed towards anyone. I mean, at least in those cinematics, that's for sure. Speaking of aesthetics, I'd also like to mention something about his design, which I love, of course. It's a lot more intricate than any of the other characters of the series, apart from maybe Eggman. But I think Shadow's case is a lot more intentional. Unlike the main trio, Shadow is not solely represented by one color. While Sonic is best known for his almost entirely blue body, Shadow deviates from this by not just his black fur, but the red highlights in his quills, arms, and legs. This not only serves to represent his complexity, as he has more than just one color in his fur, but shows that he cannot be defined by one characteristic. The intricacies of his gear also serve to send the message that he is not someone who traverses the world with a simple pair of sneakers, but actual gear that was created for him, giving the viewer this sense that he is something more. To add to that, as one can discover by looking at any popular portrayal of the bad boy archetype, Shadow is not just this violent renegade that the promotional material for the game would have you believe. As we saw in his debut, there is a softer side to this character that is a staple of the bad boy character, typically hidden by the rough, rugged exterior on purpose. Even before 2005, Shadow already fit into this bad boy archetype and actually did it really well. So let's finally discuss the concept of a bad boy. According to research done by Robert J. Ashford in 2016, the bad boy character came as a sort of reaction after Hollywood faced pressure from educational, government, and religious groups to make their stories solely about teaching good morals after the Great Depression. After the war, the late 1940s saw Hollywood blossom with more teenage rebels, some with or without cause, whose bad boy persona came from a more psychological root, and illustrated them as more complex than the simple troublemakers of earlier stories. This framework for the contemporary bad boy is one that I'd like to use for understanding the appeal of Shadow as a character, since I believe Shadow's depth lies in his complexity. Firstly, I think we love this trope so much because when we see characters that rebel against the norm or act harshly, and are given a reason for it like grief, think Punisher, or protectiveness like the Kingpin with Vanessa, or any other sort of parent character, we are given a dimension to that character that immediately resonates with us to some degree. And while that may not justify them, it allows us to sympathize with them. In Shadow's case, I think this trope has even more intrigue due to the fact that he is supposed to be this dark reflection of Sonic, who has a great appeal in his own right because he rejects certain norms as well. Definitely its own video. As one could look at Shadow as a sort of what could be. Shadow's introduction meant a lot to the Sonic world because of the darker elements he brought with him, that not only showed the capabilities of the writing team, but offered more avenues of reflection for the audience of the series. Not only did we see the darker side of this world, but with it understood that this world, like ours, wasn't so black and white, with some evil scientist or selfless hero. With Shadow's game heavily emphasizing the moral ambiguity of his character, we should then discuss the morality of the bad boy archetype, since the whole idea behind the bad boy with a heart of gold is that the description is, and in and of itself, a juxtaposition. When describing and defining the attributes of this archetype, Gopaldas and Molander in 2020 went on to say that traits like aggression and rebelliousness can just as easily be spun as positive traits like fearlessness and liberated, or as negative traits like criminal or deviant. This can also be said of his good qualities. This fluidity between right and wrong, acceptable and contemptible, or pleasant and unpleasant keeps us engaged beyond the relatively more simple appeal of the straightforward style and attitude of Sonic himself, who will always fight evil for the sake of good. In fiction and in the once simple stories of Sonic, moral ambiguities can make fictional characters seem more real, transport viewers into on-screen life worlds, and inject much needed suspense into otherwise predictable storylines. I think most would agree that the sort of Flanderization Sega overhauled their Sonic cast with was misguided. And while it certainly did more harm for the writing of the characters during that time, in Shadow's case, I think his game uses his individualistic personality to set him apart from the other characters, which sounds kind of obvious, I guess, now that I think about it. But by the end of the story, he chooses to move on from his past and defeat Black Doom because he wants to overcome this struggle with identity. With Shadow, we really get to see his decision in becoming good due to his own autonomy, which is something that resonates very well with us. The story uses that moral ambiguity to show us Shadow's ability to supersede the exterior pressures of other societal concepts of right and wrong, to come to his own conclusion. So whether you as an audience member enjoyed the resolution to this game, you can be assured that it was Shadow's decision. I find it apt that Sega has decided to use Shadow as Batman in the crossover series because he has the obvious tragic backstory parallel, and with both characters we see that they choose to do good, and for what reason. So while Shadow isn't always pure-hearted or charismatic like Sonic, he chooses to do the right thing in the end for his own reasons, and not because of some general concept of good and evil. In the future, I hope Sega leans into this Batman parallel more, so not only do we get to see the badass side of Shadow, but the crucial sentimental side as well. It works for Batman so well because when we see Batman relate to children he saves, we understand why. And it makes those moments impactful because it shows the depth to the character. Moments that stick out to me, like in Justice League Unlimited when Batman decides to sit and talk with Ace, or in Matt Reeves' Batman when he saves the kid from the car. It would be really cool to see Shadow take on this role of the grim hero, perhaps a protector of the city of some kind, to find this healthier balance of angst and virtue. Sega, please make Shadow Arkham City, and my heart and wallet are yours. which seems a lot more viable with Ian Flynn at the helm and his writing for Shadow Generations, which is also its own discussion, so let me know if you'd like to hear my thoughts on that. And while I don't know if or when the next Shadow spin-off game will be, it would be really interesting to see him take on this kind of journey. We can embrace the kind of bad boy archetype that frames him in a constant state of turmoil and at war with himself, resisting his norms and fighting against his own emotions and conscience. This struggle takes a hefty toll on the bad boy, pushes him past his limits, and wears him down physically and mentally. So while I don't think we need Shadow to have a gun and kill people again, I think that edge that Sega doubled down on, while definitely cheesy, still served the ultimate purpose of making him more dynamic as a character. The inner conflict is something I really think can be expanded upon. It would really be something if we got to see Shadow endure some kind of other tragedy besides Maria's, or even help someone through their own. The other thing to note about the bad boy archetype is that those characters act as a social commentary, not as a decisive stance on good or bad, but they can illustrate the complex or contradictory nature of ourselves. As we talked about before, the many-sidedness of a character can fascinate us because we as people are attracted to the unpredictable, and are sometimes enticed to challenge ourselves in understanding the abstruse, because we ourselves are not completely transparent. We can understand the bad boy as an actor for opposition against what is accepted. Whether he is altering a stable situation or forcing society to question its standards, the bad boy is always working to convey the maladies of society and illuminating the options for resistance and rebellion. I think this image of a renegade we associate with Shadow, as well as his defiant personality, relate to those of us who view ourselves as outside our milieu. If you think about it in a greater sense, the state the Sonic franchise is in now, what with all the cringe and irony, is almost because of this game, along with other things, but we don't need to talk about that. But at the same time, that cringe actually serves to resonate more with those fans who are ostracized because of their own interest in it. Just as Shadow demonstrates individuality, his fans admire and aspire to achieve that same fearlessness. On the other hand, Shadow's avid individualism encourages us to make our own judgments by providing a novel perspective. In SA2, we are offered a darker story that shows Shadow as a victim to government meddling. Despite being usually told to support authority in various media, we are provided with an opposing view that gives us a chance to assess the moral grayness of the situation, and evaluate whether or not Shadow's revenge is fully justified. By the end of the story, the day is saved, but there is room left to judge if what was done to Shadow was right. His character challenges us to admit that changes are necessary, but they can also indicate that current social norms should remain unchanged. Whether they are loved or hated by the public or even cause a social divide, these figures succeed in drawing attention to social issues and providing commentary on them. Both Sonic and Shadow are supposed to represent that resistance to the social norm, one being a free spirit and one being a direct rejection of society. Both of them allow us to experience an escape from the confinements of our norms by providing examples of what we can be. With a character like Shadow who breaks these social norms in order to solidify their individualism and answers to no one, these traits provide commentary on the society they live in, and by proxy, ours, as he shows us that authority isn't always good, but also to give humanity a chance. Bad boys hold a mirror to the rules and regulations we live in and around to understand why some might work and why others might not. Shadow chooses to save the world for his own reasons, not simply because of some pure of heart altruism, which gives him this autonomy that defies the expectations we have of typical heroes. A character who is simultaneously haunted by his past and free from the constraints of society. These kinds of contradictions make for a compelling character, and one that we not only see ourselves in, but use to explore our own identities through as well. Vigilantes and anti-heroes intrigue us because they can show us the visceral desires we might be too afraid to show in a satisfying way, and can inspire others who see themselves in those identities. So why do we like Shadow? Because he's a rebel. He's complex. He's tragic. And yet, fearless. He is all of these things because he chooses to be. Well, maybe not the tragic part, but you know what I'm saying. To make the comparison to Sonic, once again, we find that Sonic loves his independence and freedom and wants that for everyone. And while both Sonic and Shadow exude their individuality, Shadow finds his identity despite his past. It proves to us, the viewer, that whatever you come from, and whatever the world regards you as, you still choose to be you. Shadow the Hedgehog is a fictional escape that directly reflects our own reality, that many take to project their desires they might not be able to express on the outside. one that directly rebels and outright rejects society. We latch on to Shadow initially for his cool aesthetic and a defiance of expectations, but when we come to learn who he really is and what he fights for, we are drawn even closer to him for his relatability. This is something that I've come to really understand through other fandoms I like to consider myself a part of. With nuance comes relatability and intrigue. Thus opens the floodgates to the universes of imagination the fans will create. As I've discovered in my own research, and is likely apparent to many of you, the more of ourselves we see in characters in media, the more we apply them to our own identities. There are the obvious myriads of Sonic OCs and fanfictions that have been joked about to death, but I don't have any desire to do any of that. I am a Thomas the Tank Engine fan, and a Sonic the Hedgehog fan. I'm painfully aware of the cringe that the fan base of each is capable, but that will never stop me from appreciating the creativity that most, if not all, put into their work that incorporates their identity in order to represent the passion they have for something they enjoy. Likewise, I will always enjoy the official stories that strive to make these characters feel so real, so that they can allow us to see ourselves in them, and choose for ourselves what qualities we want to take for our own journeys. Thank you for watching, and here's to the fearless ear of Shadow. Also, please let me know if you like this. I know this is something completely new, so I'd really like to talk more about the Sonic franchise if there are enough of you who want to see it. Maybe I'll do a video like this for Sonic or for other characters in the franchise, and maybe I can do an actual analysis of Shadow Generations once I get around to it. So let me know. Let me know how you feel, and thank you again.